I'm delighted to be here to share this space with all of you today. I am going to start off today with something that is frankly new to me, that I am patterning off of activity and acknowledgements that started with my time at ARL, really through our Canadian representatives who, through their truth and reconciliation activities, made it a pattern to acknowledge the land on which we roam, on which we gather, and in which we work. So I would like to acknowledge the territory from which I'm speaking at this moment, which is the traditional homelands of the Woodland people, which Purdue University is built upon, and to take the time to honor and appreciate the Potawatomi, the Potawatomi, the Lenape or the Delaware, the Miami, and the Shawnee people, the nations who are the ancestral indigenous caretakers of this land. I think part of framing this conversation today and going forward is just understanding our history and perhaps reimagining and retelling the stories of our history, certainly here in the United States, but I think throughout the world. And it's important to take time to acknowledge those histories. So this is not an easy topic, particularly I think today. I think that with respect to vocabulary, with respect to how we speak about this collective issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it would be a lost opportunity to not acknowledge what happened on May 25th of this year. Of course, within the broader context that's already been referenced with respect to the global pandemic and the economic impact on all of us and the behavioral impact on all of us, and how that may have positioned us to experience and to ingest, if you will, this experience of the killing of George Floyd by police officers. And not that that in itself was necessarily the catalyst, because I think we all recognize and know that these issues have been building up and the realization of these realities have been building up for many, many decades. And certainly within the last few years, within this decade, these realizations have intensified and certainly people have mobilized around this particular topic. So even for me, for practitioners in this space, for people who engage in this work on a daily basis, and I might assert that we all do, actually, whether we know it or not. But even for us who have professional titles that are reflective of this type of activity, this day really changed a lot for us in terms of, I think, a worldwide perspective on how we deal with these issues, how we interpret these issues, and of course, within this context, how we speak about these issues, how we describe these issues, and most importantly, how we tell the stories of those who have been marginalized, oppressed, who have been the subject, quite frankly, of genocide, if we can be that frank here today. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think it's important to do so. So yeah, so the language has changed. And it continues to change. It continues to evolve. This is, again, certainly nothing that is unique to 2020 and the sort of the unfortunate confluence of the pandemic, economic realities, and the social unrest and protests that have been that came out of that experience in May of this year, but certainly for years and decades and centuries beforehand. But the vocabulary continues to change, and I, in my space, again as a practitioner here, I've witnessed how this vocabulary has changed, the interpretations of of these words have changed over time. So let's spend some time reflecting on and talking about this a little bit. I phrased these, you know, have I think a collection of slides here, and I've kind of categorized some of this vocabulary in sort of, you know, easy and accessible, and maybe a bit more challenging, and maybe, you know, really challenging. But that is of course a subjective view of that, a subjective interpretation, and so, you know, you may feel that some of these terms are quite difficult. Some of you may feel like the ones that I've classified as actually challenging and difficult are in fact quite easy. So this is all subjective, but I thought I would walk through this to illustrate how our thinking and how our descriptions of history and realities and of cultural heritage, indeed of even empiricism, you know, and the empirical outputs changing and will continue to change. Because I think that is just a reality of where we are, where we're headed. So these are just some examples of vocabulary, and we won't spend a great deal of time walking through and really scrutinizing every definition, but I just wanted to give you a sense of where we are and where we're headed. I think that all of us, of course, are familiar, you know, with its title around diversity, equity, inclusion, which are reflective in this first slide. You know, one thing that I frequently speak about is the degree to which diversity has come to be, you know, perhaps a watered down term, perhaps a term that isn't reflective of a reality that, in fact, as Todd was mentioning earlier, that might lead to effective change and to authentic change and authentic action in this space. We talk about that diversity across the full range of human identities and human expressions, and we'll walk through this more in detail. And is difference a more accurate reflection of what we're trying to identify, what we're trying to describe as we think about this. Equity, I'll go into that a little bit more. I'm sure most of you have seen the memes that are being you know, frequently presented across the, you know, in spaces similar to this, and that differentiate equity from equality. And we will talk about that as we will talk about a definition of inclusion that I have been using quite a bit from two organization development experts, I would say, Judith Katz and Frederick Miller, and we'll walk through that. Multiculturalism, I think many of us think of, or some of us think of, as somewhat of an old-fashioned or maybe even antiquated term, but referring to you know, the presence of people and who embody identities and cultural expressions that are reflective of a range of cultures and ethnicities, nationalities, and that sort of thing. And, you know, our ability to really respect and honor and perhaps even leverage the perspectives and the strength that multicultural presence brings to us. So, and there's a lot of talk these days. I think helpful dialogue around a sense of belonging and creating environments where people feel like they do belong, and importantly, how we engage the behavior and the language to ensure that people feel that they have an open invitation to join us as we think about created environments and cultures where people, you know, where people can fully engage. So we'll talk about some of this as we move forward here. This is the definition of inclusion that I have been using with some frequency, and I have found that this really resonates with many of the audiences with whom I engage. And that is, again, like I said, from Judith Katz, inclusion being a sense of belonging, feeling respected and valued for who you are, a sense of being provided a level of supportive energy and commitment from others that allows you to do your best. I think that's really critical, that allows you to do your best in that space, regardless of the context. Another way that Judith and Frederick refer to this is a sense of belonging in such a way that you don't have to leave your authentic self in the parking lot or, at the bus stop before entering into a space, largely, in the context of discussions around workplace environments and that sort of thing, but certainly you can think about that in a broad range of contexts. So I hope you find that, that definition to be helpful. This is what I was referencing earlier. I'm sure many of you have seen this meme and any variations. I'll share another variation of that with you. But the difference, the key delineation here between equality and equity, probably most of you know, or all of you have heard at some point, is with respect to, particularly with respect to resource allocation, and that equality is referring to the equal distribution of resources. So everybody gets the same box, to be able to position themselves to see, or in this case in the left frame, to not see the ball game that's been played. Whereas equity really takes into consideration the starting point and the context of every individual and what they need to participate equally in the activity, and so that the outcomes of their participation in society, in social structures, political structures, and financial structures, in fact, will lead to the same outcome. This is one that I find particularly, I think, helpful, and that I've been using. And if we look at that lower left quadrant, unfortunately, the reality, if we really think critically about history and the history of advantage that has been created through policy and through norms over a course of many centuries, people are not starting, from the same point, right? I particularly like, and I think everyone is probably very familiar with this concept of liberation in terms of really tearing down the barriers that do not allow for that equity, that keep equity from being realized. And I think that's something that there's certainly a lot of conversation around that, and hopefully also in tandem with that, some conversations about creating a vision for the future, because it's one thing to say, well, let's tear down the wall. It's another thing entirely to say, okay, well, let's do some bold envisioning about what that future reality might look like, so that we can realize that equity. So hopefully you'll find that helpful. So transitioning a little bit over to some other things that are perhaps a little bit more challenging, and again, we'll just really look over, review this in a cursory sort of way. But with respect to how we identify certain groups that hold particular identities, I identify as a Latino male. U.S. citizen of Mexican descent. There are many ways that I can say that, but am I a minority? Am I a racial and ethnic minority, or is it more really appropriate to call me a member of a minoritized racial or ethnic group? Swinging, perspective there in terms of that. The numerical minorityness of my experience was really imposed upon me, right, due to colonization, and same experience with those who are of ancestry from Africans who were enslaved. Being in an academic context, making that transition relatively recently from ARL to Purdue, we use on campus the concept of underrepresented minorities on college campuses, and many of you may be familiar with that, but not without its, without its complexity and the exceptions to that, because underrepresented minorities in a context of higher education are those who identify as Asian, or of Asian ancestry, or even international students of Asian descent, are they underrepresented in their education and in certain professional sectors and that sort of thing? And is that an appropriate appellation for those communities? Are we people of color? You know, that's a phrase that I think we are quite familiar with. And a reframing of even that is around Black, Indigenous people of color, with the purpose there really accentuating and centering, really opening that title with, again, the acknowledgement of the particular oppression and lack of advantage through history that has been granted Black populations and to Indigenous populations. Um, how we speak about people with disabilities is really interesting. I was on a panel presentation not too long ago, and there was someone from the UK who was a disabled person, and I think I referred to her, or maybe others have referred to her as a person with disabilities. In her perspective from the UK, I don't know if this change was that it was really odd to use that term, a person with disabilities. She also identified as queer, and she said, "I'm not a person with queerness, I am a queer person." And so, just some nuance there that I think are really interesting. But that language is also quite fluid. Much talk, in terms of identifying. On my opening slide, I identified my pronouns as he and him. And acknowledging the fluidity of gender expression and how people these days do not identify along those polarities of really a social construction of gender identity and translating neurodiversity. So I think we're all familiar with most of these. These are some of the hard ones, and again, we'll spend a great deal of time on these. But just to highlight a few things, I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with the term microaggressions. And although we may think of that as fairly new vocabulary, that term has actually been around for many, many years, since the early 70s, by a researcher and professor at Harvard, Chester Pierce. Probably more commonly popularized, I guess you would say, by Darrell Wing Su of Columbia. The term social justice is a popular one, unfortunately one that is seen as highly politicized, unfortunately. But there are many fantastic definitions of that. One that I particularly am fond of is by a researcher, Leanne Bell, who describes social justice as the full and equal participation of all groups in the society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. And with it includes a vision of society in which the distribution of resources, harkening back to the memes that I was just sharing with you, really ensures that equitable outcomes across identity groups and populations. I think that's a particularly helpful definition of that. Decolonization is something that may be new to some of you, where it is literally the removal of colonial influence. In context, it means literally, removing, such as in some states that have become independent of colonial rule, some countries that have been removed of that colonial rule. In some instances, of course, it refers to things like repatriation of artifacts and even of vocabulary. The concept of witness is very, very complicated, as is white supremacy and white supremacy culture. Those are things that many people are thinking about and talking about and publishing and writing about. And the degree to which the difference between those three, I think is fairly manageable, fairly easy to describe, where the concept of whiteness is really a social reality, a social construct, where white supremacy is simply a system of racial hierarchy that really extends from the 1600s and was kind of codified in specious science in the 1700s in these in Germany, and out of a process called craniometry, I think what it's called, where there was a study of skulls from across different continents, and a hierarchy of beauty was created. and of course, the concept of white supremacy culture and the degree to which that very hierarchy which I referred is embedded in so much of what we do. So many of our social systems, our political system, and indeed in our right within archives, within libraries, cultural heritage, and memory organizations. Lots of talk these days about the concept of racism and the concept of anti-racism. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, I have never heard in the last 4 months so many references to the concept of systemic racism. We'll walk through those in just a moment. So with respect to racism, there are many different definitions that one can find about this. Some of this related to prejudice, some of us related to discrimination, and it is complicated. There are many authors, are writing about the concept of racism and how that can be or cannot be necessarily a transactional or relational sort of right. Can somebody who does not hold power really be a racist? Is it more appropriate that we classify or describe activities of that nature as discrimination or rooted in prejudice? That is, the prejudging, right? Those unfavorable attitudes against others of different race or different ethnicity, identity than your own. So this is something that I think I hope very, very useful. And this is what I describe as racism. The kind of challenges that idea about whether racism can be, again, the transactional or based on a relationship. And if we describe prejudice, the concept of prejudice as I previously described as unfavorable attitudes, and if we couple that with the concept of systemic power, and of course there are many different kinds of power. There's power in personality, perhaps in someone's charism, right? There is power that is rooted in title and in station. Somebody who is the CEO of an organization, someone who is a supervisor of others. But the definition that I'm using here and the organization from which I have been borrowing quite liberally, Community Change of Boston, they describe systemic powers, behaviors that are reinforced by laws, by policies, by norms, and by culture. And that racism itself is actually the combination of racial prejudice that is in fact reinforced, upheld, if you will, by systemic power. So if we talk about having an anti-racist lens, if we talk about engaging in activity that is specifically anti-racist, then that is activity that will in one way or another lead to the dismantling and the destruction, the decoupling, if you will, of that racial prejudice with that systemic power. These are fluid again. There are many different sort of definitions and sources, I think, for compelling definitions. Is there a question, or I hear audio? Oh, okay, so I just wanted to go through a little bit, provide some examples around, in this instance, decolonization, and these are fairly recent examples that have come across my desk, if you will. And I find this particularly compelling, I think particularly useful with respect to the guiding principles for description at the Rubenstein Library at Duke University. And their attempts to really center the experiences, realities of underrepresented or marginalized, historically oppressed communities, and to provide an opportunity to provide them agency, right? And the power. Again, if we go back to that concept of systemic power, the power to really direct and define their own narrative, their own descriptions, the descriptions that are reflective of their own realities. And that's one thing that I really want to emphasize, I think, in these last few minutes. I know it's confusing and it can be very confusing with respect to the fluidity of these definitions. You know, and these things are often are quite often critiqued, and people push back against this. And so the question I think I would like to pose as an opportunity to reflection for all of us is this really political correctness gone amok, or should we really view this changing vocabulary as an opportunity to honor people's lived experiences, to refer to well, to us, because I feel like I'm inclusive of that, in ways that really acknowledge the expanse and fluidity of the human experience and the expression and contemporary understanding of how these identities and representations came to be realized. So perhaps it's called to all of us to what is called cultural humility, which is not a term that I included in my slides, but that is an understanding that will never actually come completely competent. We'll never actually realize complete cultural competency. That is, we will not realize this finite set of skills or knowledge. But what we hope to do is allow those realities and experiences of others to be central to our engagement with them, right? And that we commit to really lifelong learning and to a journey of growth and understanding of others, and a commitment to what many of you might have been exposed to early, previously, the platinum rule, right? A treating of others not as we would like to be treated, as we would like to be treated, but as they would prefer to be treated. So I hope that contextualization is a little bit helpful for all of you. This is, again, something that I came across just a couple of days ago. Application in British Columbia of this particular tribal council and their archive that's transitioning away from the Dewey Decimal System without even consideration of the Library of Congress, because they found that to be ineffective, and changing their classification scheme, their organization scheme, to this Brian Deere classification system, which really focuses and accentuates the concept of place, because the concept of place, of geography, of land is so critical to indigenous communities, and the appropriateness of define in such a way that is reflective of that reality. So I hope that's a good example. This is something that I hope many of you are aware of DocNow, and this is really a project that started many years ago in various iterations out of the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, and the concept of the practice of documenting social media and creating educational opportunities around that documentation, and looking at how we curate, how we describe these experiences. So I encourage you to look at DocNow as a contemporary manifestation of a concept of decolonization, and really putting again the authority, putting the power of description into the hands of those who are witnessing and who are experiencing these realities. In this case, the reality, unfortunately, of police brutality. Just in a few minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about decolonizing access. This is something that I think is complex, and it's multi-layered, because when I think about this, I think about this at a high, sort of a macro level, if you will, and a micro level, probably in a mezzo level too, if you want to think about a sociological framing of this. But these are just some things I offer to you in terms of how we do this. I mean, I think certainly, there's just in terms of realized access. I mean, we're talking literal access. The global pandemic, I think, has accentuated how tenuous this is, and how communities of color in particular disproportionately impacted by the global pandemic, and the degree to which people have access to education, have access to the technology to facilitate learning and that sort of thing. And these are just some things that I hope will be helpful in terms of acknowledging, committing to counter that historical legacy of oppression and disadvantage. This is how we think about decolonizing and contextualize access. Again, I've talked much about relinquishing and sharing power, especially with those from marginalized, underrepresented, historically oppressed communities, and to really rethinking the concept of authority, the concept of notability, if you will, and how we frame that and how we come to determine that. I think this is really critical because it's one thing to just acknowledge that communities that are historically marginalized or oppressed really deserve to have the opportunity to tell their own story, to create their own taxonomy, their own descriptive practices, and but you know, communities, historically oppressed communities, legitimately and understandably have a sense of distrust, especially for large systems like higher education systems, you know, large political systems like a library or like an archive. And so the thing that I'd like for us as a community to think about is how do we develop authentic relationships where that power sharing can happen, and where the curatorial role, if we think of something like post-custodial archival practice, for example, that really provides the agency, the authority, and the power of those communities to make those things happen. And lastly, I will just share, I think something that has been helpful to me in my thinking in the next slide is, you know, how do we accelerate the critical paradigm shifts that are necessary in the pursuit of equity. And I'll share this. We don't have time to go through this in any great detail, but you know, how do we facilitate and affect paradigm shifts from equality to us thinking about equity? You know, for us thinking about at-risk or disadvantaged populations, to acknowledging and to focusing deliberately on the dismantling of and the rebuilding of broken and problematic systems. How do we create a shift from the minimization of difference, if we think earlier, you know, to my slide, this concept of color blindness, right, to self-examination of our own positionality within these systems and within, you know, identities. How do we shift from learning about other cultures to dismantling those systems of power and privilege? How do we position ourselves to rethink the concept of celebrating diversity, particularly when diversity and identities, you know, are we really asking people from alienated identities to celebrate aspects of society, to celebrate aspects of difference for which they are routinely oppressed? And if so, to whose benefit? How can I engage them in a decision to do so? And can I justify the use of limited resources for celebration when inequities persist? And finally, the focus on intent and shifting away from that to the concept of impact. You know, we'll share these slides with you. These are adopted from people who are writing about multiculturalism in education, but I think this framing of these critical paradigm shifts, I think, are particularly helpful. So I think I will wrap up there. I don't know, I believe Todd is.
Yeah, fine.
Yep.
So thank you so much. That was a great way to kick us off, and I'd appreciate your introduction to some of these topics. Building on one of the topics that you raised about fluidity, about how some of these identities, some of these aspects are of people's characteristics can change over time. There's a question here about that came in from one of our participants about so gender, race, and religion are frequently mentioned in the context of diversity, but rarely age discrimination is acknowledged. In terms of how you've talked about some of these things, in terms of gender fluidity, or in terms of, you know, people's abilities or disabilities, often changes over time. Similarly, age is something that changes over time. How can we address some of those complexities?
Oh, wow, that's a powerful question. Yeah, and I think, you know, acknowledging again the sort of the imperfection of all of this, and you know, I mean, acknowledging that, you know, wow, I wasn't even inclusive of any related terms in this presentation. So I think that you know, remaining cognizant of these things is extremely important. I mean, I think that there is a lot of valuable dialogue. You know, I mean, in our professional sector, certainly around generation difference, right? And the implications, more importantly, the implications to that generational difference as it applies to, you know, ability and that sort of thing. You know, because there are you know, something like disability, and not that it has to be or is always, you know, at the intersection of generational or age difference, but it is certainly something that a lot of us, you know, realize over a course of time, right? I think remaining cognizant of it, keeping the dialogue present, you know, acknowledging and understanding and supporting research that is done around age discrimination and that sort of thing, I think is really critical. Just in the way we think about critical race theory, critical gender theory, and that sort of thing. So I appreciate that feedback very much.
Um, you know, I think a lot of this goes to, and something that I think we as a community really need to build on, was your point about honoring people's lived experiences and how powerful that is, and how we can build some of that honoring into the language that we use, as well as honoring them by using their languages as well.
Correct. Right. Yeah, I think that's critical, and like I said, you know, it reflects that sort of difference between that, you know, my Catholic roots keep coming up here, but you know, the differentiation between the golden rule and the platinum rule, right? We can't make assumptions based on our own identities and our own lived experiences about how other people prefer to be treated or to prefer to be reflected you know, in history, or you know, otherwise being described in terms of cultural expressions, or even ways of knowing. You know, that's a big conversation, particularly within indigenous communities, and how Western methods of empiricism do not reflect the way they see and engage in the world. And so I think it's really critical for us to be open to that, and to understand that, you know, if we go back to conceptness, that we're very much enveloped in these Western ways of thinking and the Western ways of doing, and that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with those ways. Where it's highly problematic and actually becomes oppressive is when we assume those ways are the only way. We assume that those ways are the norm and should be the norm, and that those ways are the metric. They are the way we create value and judge the value of others. I think that's the critical piece of that.
That is such a great place to end. Uh, Mark, I want to thank you so much for the introduction, and you know, particularly for the land acknowledgement. Needed to include that in my introduction, but I appreciate you having that.
We're on a journey. Thank you for the opportunity to be here again. Take care, everybody. I hope it's a good day for everyone.